Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. Today in this segment, we are excited and honored to welcome one of Project Censored's summer interns. Each summer, Project Censored has the great privilege of working with students from around the country who apply for a summer internship to work with us on independent media-related issues. And this summer, again, no different. We had more than 30 applications. We were only able to take 3. And one of the recipients we're, again, really honored to be working with this summer is Jayden Henry. He's from the Atlanta area and is a junior at Vanderbilt University. He's studying political science and history. One of the things that Jayden did with us this summer is he's writing a dispatch on media and politics. So it's an in-depth kind of look at a particular topic with a critical media literacy lens. And the dispatch that Jayden is writing is, again, it's the culmination of his project for the summer 2025 internship with us. Jayden is also, I'm delighted to share with you, the host of a weekly radio program called I Want to Tell You Something on WRVU in Nashville, Tennessee. Jayden will maybe talk to us a little bit more about that later in the segment today. But we're going to talk about his dispatch, which will eventually be posted and published as one of the dispatches on media politics and Project Censored over at projectcensored.org. The dispatch is titled Blood, Sweat, and Stitches, How Overconsumption Pushes Garment Workers to the Brink. Jayden Henry, first and foremost, welcome to the Project Censored Show.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
So, Jayden, let's just start from a logical place. Your title is quite provocative and also kind of really explains what your topic is. But tell our listeners a little bit. What exactly is the topic of your research with us this summer, and what led you to want to research this more deeply?
So for my topic for my dispatch this summer, I really want to focus on the issue that doesn't get a lot of, press coverage, not only in media, but also it's just not talked about in our, tailored discussions in our daily lives in any substantial way. And so I want to talk about something that seems like a bit on the fringe in terms of what seems appropriate to discuss in our daily lives, but it's actually something that we affect quite often. That's, our input into, various streams of consumerism, but particularly, the things we buy and the things we wear. And I think, one of the things that drew me to this topic was this idea as of late, I would say from the past 20, 25, 30 years, this idea, in developed countries, especially in the United States, that, that we are first and foremost consumers, that we have to buy what is in. And what we have done is we have created a consumer economy that enables us. But the flip side is that it's really hurting the workers that enable us to have this luxury.
So, Jayden, there's a couple of issues going on here, of course. You just mentioned the backdrop of Western overconsumption habits and the way in which Western consumers define themselves by what they buy. And you also alluded to the sort of, what eventually we're going to get into here is obviously the topic of fast fashion, but the idea that you've got to have what's new or trendy to define yourself as hip or cool or whatever, and which is an issue into itself, right, sociologically. Culturally, but also you're pointing out in your dispatch, of course, the underside of all this. And while this has certainly been the subject of other documentaries and programs over the years and some investigation, you're really dredging this up again because there's a lot of other developments that are happening. You start your dispatch by talking about a report from a trade publication, Business of Fashion. You talk about particularly a country that's really big in the production of fast fashion is China. You talk about tariffs. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of the issues are related to your subject, particularly obviously then segueing into issues that you uncovered about labor and labor malpractice? Jayden Henry.
Exactly. So the intro to my dispatch is talking about a very new and recent development, which is that we're seeing not necessarily a pivot away, but a focus on, this goes beyond, fast fashion brands like, H&M or, PacSun or Zara or whatever. It goes to these, companies like Shein and like Temu that are taking products directly from factories to consumers. And you especially saw this, after the coronavirus pandemic, where all of a sudden you could buy, a shirt or, a pair of jeans for $6 and some tax from China. And what that does is it oversaturates a market that one is already oversaturated. And also what it does is really just push these workers that are making these products to the brink. And, it just goes beyond our previous standards for overconsumption. Some people think that new tariffs are gonna staunch this cascading effect, but it seems that ultimately it's going to continue. It's going to be a little expensive for American consumers, but then doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to stop doing it.
Yeah, and Jayden, some of the things that I'm pulling out from your piece right now, really well researched and well written dispatch that'll be up at projectcensored.org. Um, you write about how more than, and this is quote, more than 75 million people worldwide work to bring cheap, fashionable clothing from sweltering factories in developing countries to stock shelves in more wealthy, secure nations. And fewer than 2% of those workers are paid a minimum wage. And you mentioned the company Shein earlier, and you talk about workers there sometimes working upwards of 75 hours a week. I mean, this goes back in U.S. history. If you go back a century, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and the disasters it resulted. And of course, even now, with the Amazon warehouses and different things, exploitative labor. So this is a global phenomenon. But here, you're writing about something that would you argue and again, we don't need to, it's not the oppression Olympics as they're called. These are extraordinarily detrimental conditions in which these people are working and living. Jayden Henry.
Exactly. I think we've seen read stories about people that work at, warehouses for companies like Amazon, United States. They have like 12-hour work days, not always access to a bathroom. But that really pales in comparison to the conditions, abroad. For example, in factories in Shein, like Shein factories in China and for other companies, um, they're working upwards of 75 hours a week. And some people would say, well, those are standards for those countries, but it's actually not. Even in China, it's supposed to be strictly limited to 40 hours a week. And so it's a matter of these companies that are, headquartered in countries like, the United States, H&M, I believe it's either Sweden or Denmark, et cetera, et cetera. But what they're doing is they're outsourcing their production to these countries where I don't know if I would say they feel like they can exploit these people, but they're enabled.
You mentioned Jayden in your piece. You mentioned from more than a decade ago. You talk about what's called the Rana Arena Plaza factory in Bangladesh. You cite this because it was a very severe case where there was more than 1,000 people killed in this factory collapse. This is an extraordinary situation. But these are the kind of things that you uncovered in your research. And I just wanted to ask you, obviously you were attuned to this in order to select it as a research topic. But can you talk a little bit about, was there an evolution of your thinking the more that you researched this, the more that you looked into this, and of course, the more you saw some of these more barbaric kind of events that have taken place, even in the recent past?
Absolutely. So I will say that, my understanding of, international economic models was that, over the last, quarter of a century, it's generally been, uniformly positive. That was my understanding. But when I did my research, what I found was that, we in the United States, and, we, if you live in like Canada or Europe, Australia or whatnot, of course we benefit from this, stratified, decentered economic model, but it's about the people in what you would call the periphery countries that produce our goods as opposed to us in the core. And what I found is that, of course, they're in those factories voluntarily, but they are truly suffering. It's like, we previously had, garment making industries in the United States that have since moved over to countries like China, Bangladesh, India, et cetera, et cetera. But, but it's really been blown out of proportion. I don't think, I don't think any American can imagine, working 75 hours a week, you know, 10, 12, 15-hour work days, stitching shirts and, hemming blouses. It's really, just painful, exhausting work to the point that, for example, it's not even, factory to consumer countries like Shein. It's, bigger countries like Nike, where, they have factories in Cambodia where, they see like 10, 15 people a month, faint from heat exposure or just plain exhaustion. And so the evolution of my thinking is just really, going from a mindset that of a consumer to a mindset of, just seeing these things that are happening and saying, it's terrible that our choices are enabling this.
Yeah, and of course, you write about how people who protest against these kind of poor conditions are often arrested or beaten in the streets. So very draconian and authoritarian kind of methods to keep them in. You also talk about what happened during COVID-19. You write about how the pandemic brought what we would say the luxury of working right from the comfort of one's home, as you talk about in your dispatch. But factory workers were often driven into further despair, and there was more of an economic downturn. Can you talk a little bit about again, it's an inequality in the way workers are treated depending upon what part of the industry that they might align in. And of course, you mentioned earlier in terms of geopolitics, you talked about a core of countries. I know you talk about an imperial core. Can you maybe tie those together or talk a little bit about those concepts, Jayden Henry?
Yes. So for a framework as to how I shared this article when talking about the imbalance of power, us people who live in the United States, or if you live in the UK or France or Germany or whatnot, generally speaking, highly developed countries that may have had an imperial past, are termed as the imperial core, meaning the people in the countries that are the main consumers, whereas people that live in the periphery, like Bangladesh, uh, Ethiopia, there's a lot of factors in Ethiopia, Myanmar, Vietnam, etc. The periphery, they're outside of that traditional consumer block. They're the ones that are providing those goods, producing those goods to us. And I think the key part of, again, the protesters in Rana Plaza, which was a cataclysmic event. It was more than 1,100 people died. And they died because of corporate greed, because of this need to produce so we can consume. It was only a day prior where they saw, failing supports in the buildings. And they said, go back to work. And you had, more than 1,100 people die. People had to, some kids get their limbs amputated just to escape the rubble. Just truly, catastrophic. And so this idea that, we're above it just isn't true, because the fact is that we have a responsibility because our consumer habits and our ignorance enables these terrible things to occur. And even we know for a fact that our decision influences this, because in 2020, of course, the pandemic basically ground the economy to a halt. So you saw a lot less consumer activity. And what that did to those factory workers is that, of course, the corporations are going to, drive down orders to those factories. And so you see wages are being slashed. The wages that, keep in mind, by the way, it is rare that these employees didn't have wages. They usually get paid by item. So if their wages are slashed, they're seeing their earnings fall. their working conditions, about one every five workers was denied access to water and a toilet at their workplace. And see what that does is, they're making less money. The conditions at work are plummeting. Is that it drives them into debt. It drives them into debt in these countries. It's becoming harder and harder for them to afford to live. And so it's just a continuous downward spiral into poverty and squalor. And so when you see the effect of, the pandemic, it just really makes it clear that our choices, I hate to say trickle down, but our choices have an effect on the living standards and the working standards on these workers.
So, Jayden, what about media coverage of these issues? You went and did specific, deliberate, targeted research because you were informed, you were curious, you had an interest in these issues. Corporate media don't always cover these topics. And when they do, they don't always cover them in depth. They don't often or always cover them the way in which you talk about this subject in your dispatch. Can you talk a little bit about some of the corporate media coverage of this topic, maybe why some of the coverage is the way it is or why it's not covered much in other aspects?
Yes, of course. So, when I was doing this research, I to myself thought, why is that corporate media, if they cover anything at all, it's only the most extreme catastrophic effects like Rana Plaza. And it's become clear to me, at least, with doing the research that simple facts that they have too much to gain. Of course, media is always interested in influencing what people think and how they think about certain issues. But, since, the 21st century, the internet, we've just been, exposed to just a barrage of content that tells you need to consume, consume, consume. Because this thing is in, this thing is a status symbol, et cetera, et cetera. And, of course, those messages themselves are tailored by corporate entities to, maximize their profit and maximize revenue. And so what that does is when you have more and more people that are buying cheap, mass-produced stuff made in factories thousands and thousands of miles away, it gives the corporate media a wider audience whose ideas and decisions they can influence. And, which in turn spikes demand for these cheap mass-produced goods among consumers that have the money to spend. It's really just a cycle of, media influencing people who fund corporations, who benefit from the prevailing idea of this system.
Yeah, the manufacturing of the desire for the products. It seems like it's a symbiotic relationship that mutually benefits producers, owners of the media. I guess consumers think they're getting something out of it, but it's the itch that it's never scratched, right? There's always more,
Exactly.
right? And well, look, Jayden, we've been talking a lot about this issue, some of the challenges, but in the last few minutes we have in this segment, you write, as dire as the situation may seem, there's still some hope. And you talked to a fashion educator, a sustainable fashion educator, about some of their thoughts. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and what some of that hope is?
So yes, absolutely. So I was lucky to be able to get in contact with Gabor, who was, not only, again, a sustainable fashion educator with her own brands, but also she's director of the circular economy and the waste program at the institution, the Australian Institute. So what she has done is, take her own, entrepreneurial outfit, but also, tie it into, her background, her education on, and her position in this organization that's really trying to combat this, wasteful economy. And what she says is that, first and foremost, we as a people need to know more about the issue. We need to know more about how these workers are being exploited and, know about what we can do. She says that it would definitely be helpful to turn the tables. And what I mean by that is this economy is being propped up by the idea of that you have to have it now, now, now. that you must have what is in now. And, of course, what she told me was that it could be most helpful to make that knowledge in of itself the popular thing to do, you know, not so much as, a performative activism, standpoint, but make it make it popular to be knowledgeable about, how your dollar affects people thousands of miles away. And, ultimately what we're talking about is not just, a consumer issue, but it's more in terms of, just the basic ideas of, justice and equality and just how it's acceptable to treat people. And so, she, admits that, ultimately you can't make someone care, but what you can do is, make the situation known so that, if you can get a critical mass of people to become involved and become aware, you can really affect change. You can lobby, legislators because, the fact is that you need statute. You need stricter labor laws, stricter standards, stricter inspection standards to really make a difference. And if we can, coalesce into one single voice, then what we can do, we can really, make our voices heard and affect change.
Yeah, absolutely. Jayden Henry, anything you'd like to share with the Project Censored audience? Maybe a little bit more about your work or where they can find you online or contact you if you're interested in sharing that information.
Yes, of course. So I've really enjoyed this, internship and this, experience of, developing my own piece and, further developing my own voice and, really delving into this issue that has been really intriguing and actually is really important. In regards, other things that I'm doing, I would say that, again, my show on WRBU Nashville, which is Vanderbilt University's independent radio station, uh, I want to tell you something. It's going to be on a weekly basis. And of course, it's a generally topical show. Um, Generally speaking, WRBU is a music channel, which I kind of didn't know until I started training, but um, it's just, an amazing platform, not only for the typical, music content, but also my show, which is which when I have a guest is an interview show on pretty much anything. In the past, I've had an interview with a student about their life because they're from Honduras and how, they see the general trajectory of their country. I've had an interview with a professor about, transatlantic, geopolitics. It just could be about, really anything. And so I would definitely say, if you want to hear more from me, you can listen to I Want to Tell You Something on WRVU Nashville. But I want to reiterate with, just how valuable I found this experience to be in terms of, creating this dispatch and delving into this issue. Because it is something that really is important and also really something that has to do with us. And so, just I want to close out with the message of, it is our concern and it does have something to do with us and we can make a change, if we can make it clear to these corporations that, we're not going to be distracted, that we're not going to tolerate this exploitation, then what we can do is we can disincentivize, this, pretty plain abuse of workers.
Here, here. Well put, Jayden Henry. Jayden Henry is a junior at Vanderbilt University studying political science and history. Jayden Henry was a 2025 summer Project Censored intern, and he did a lot of research and wrote a great piece for us that is it is a dispatch on media and politics. The title of the piece, Blood, Sweat, and Stitches, How Overconsumption Pushes Garment Workers to the Brink. You can see that at projectcensored.org. Jayden Henry, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us on the Project Censored Show today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's really been a pleasure.